After 10 years alone, the widow was mocked at the ranch auction. Unaware, she owned the entire valley. The gavel comes down on an old man's life in less than 4 seconds. Nobody in the room stops to notice the woman standing at the back, in a coat too thin for the wind outside, counting bills she has already counted 3 times. They will notice her in a moment. They will laugh at her in a moment. What none of them know is that the ground under their boots, the water in their wells, and the deed to every acre they think they just bought already belongs to her. Before this story begins, ask yourself something. If everyone around you decided you were finished, would you still fight for the one thing nobody else thought was worth saving? That is what Geneva does today, in an auction yard in Montana, over an old horse nobody wanted. Stay until the end, because the moment the lawyer walks in with that steel case, this whole valley changes hands without a single shot fired. If this story moves you, like the video, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments what town or state you're watching from tonight. The Bitterroot Valley does not announce its mornings. It exhales them, slow, through a fog that clings to the fence posts until the sun burns high enough to shame it away. Geneva Calloway has watched 10,000 of these mornings from the same kitchen window, and this one arrives no different, except for the date circled in pencil on the calendar behind her, the date she has been dreading since the notice came stapled to the Pruitt gate 3 weeks ago. She is 68 years old. Her hands, wrapped around a chipped enamel mug, carry the map of a life spent working land that owes her nothing back. The house behind her is quiet in the particular way houses become quiet after a spouse dies. Not empty, exactly, but arranged around an absence, like furniture pushed to the edges of a room to make space for something that will never walk through the door again. Thomas has been gone 10 years. The valley has changed in ways he never saw coming, and Geneva has spent every one of those years learning to live inside a silence that used to hold 2 voices. Outside, frost silvers the fence line. Down the gravel road, past the leaning mailbox with the Calloway name half worn from the wood, the world has been rearranging itself without asking permission. Where the Pruitt family once ran 300 head of cattle, glossy trucks now idle outside a construction trailer, engines humming with a confidence that has nothing to do with the land and everything to do with money that was never made from it. Signs have gone up along the county road advertising Highland Meadow Estates, gated luxury parcels, Mountain View lots starting at prices that would have bought half the valley when Thomas was still alive to laugh at them. Geneva pulls on her boots at the door, the leather stiff from the cold, and does not look at the framed photograph on the wall beside it, the one of her and Thomas standing in front of the barn the year they married, both of them squinting into a sun that no longer shines the same way over this ground. She has learned not to look at it in the mornings. Looking at it in the mornings makes the whole day feel like an argument she has already lost. The reason she is dressing for town today has nothing to do with luxury lots or gated estates. It has to do with an animal. Word travels slow in a valley like this, but it travels true, and what has come to her through Del Marsh, her closest neighbor and the only man left in the county who still tips his hat instead of his head, is that the Pruitt place is being liquidated whole, livestock included, and among the stock listed on a single mimeographed sheet, buried between fencing equipment and a rusted disc harrow, is a name that stopped Geneva's breath cold when Del read it out loud over the phone. Goliath. The Clydesdale Thomas trained by hand 15 years ago, sold to the Pruitts in a lean year when the Calloway operation needed the cash more than it needed sentiment. A decision Thomas made with a jaw so tight Geneva remembers it better than she remembers most of their conversations from that season. The horse is old now, blind in one eye, according to Del, and slow enough that most ranchers would have already sent him to slaughter rather than feed him through another Montana winter. But he is still breathing, still standing in a stall on land that used to smell like something Geneva recognized. And today he goes up for auction along with everything else the Pruitts owned, to the highest bidder, with no guarantee that the highest bidder intends anything gentle for what they win. Geneva counts the bills in her coat pocket one more time before she leaves the house. It is not much. It was never meant to be a fortune, only a cushion, the kind of quiet number a widow keeps folded at the back of a drawer in case the well pump fails or the roof gives out before spring. She knows, standing in her own doorway with the cold biting at her wrists, that she may be about to spend every dollar of that cushion on an animal too old to plow a single row ever again. She locks the door behind her anyway, The way a person locks a door when they have already made a decision and simply have not said it out loud yet. Del Marsh's ranch sits 2 miles down the same gravel road, close enough that his truck lights sometimes wake Geneva's dog on nights he drives home late from town. He is 71, a widower himself, though he lost his wife to a car accident rather than the slow erosion of illness. And something in that difference has always kept a careful distance between his grief and Geneva's, two people who understand loss without ever needing to compare the shape of it out loud. It was Del who called 2 nights ago, his voice rough over a bad phone connection, reading off the mimeographed livestock list from the Pruitt foreclosure with the particular gentleness of a man delivering news he already suspects will not be received calmly. Geneva pours the last of her coffee into the sink, rinses the mug, and sets it upside down on the drying rack beside a second mug that has not been used in 10 years and that she has never once considered putting away. The drive into town takes 11 minutes in an old pickup that coughs twice before the engine catches. Along the way, the landscape performs its quiet betrayal, ranch after ranch replaced by surveyor stakes and orange flags, the bones of the valley being measured for something Geneva does not recognize as home. She passes the turnoff to the old Grange Hall, now a marketing office with tinted windows. She passes a hand-painted sign, half-faded, that once read Callaway Feed and Supply, now leaning sideways in a ditch nobody bothered to write. By the time she parks outside the Pruitt property, the auction yard is already loud with the particular energy of men who believe they are about to get something for nothing. Trucks with dealership plates still on them. Jackets that cost more than Geneva's monthly grocery bill. And somewhere in the middle of it all, standing on a raised platform like he was born knowing he would one day stand above everyone else, a young man in a charcoal coat watches the crowd gather with the patient, unhurried expression of someone counting money that has not yet left his pocket. His name, though Geneva does not know it yet, is Harrison Voss. He arrived in the Valley 18 months ago with a business card that read Highland Legacy Group and a promise, repeated in every town hall meeting since, that his developments would bring jobs, tax revenue, and prosperity to a region he described, more than once, as underutilized. He is 34 years old, the son of a Denver real estate family whose fortune was built on ski resort parcels 2 states over. And he carries the particular certainty of a man who has never once watched a harvest fail or a well run dry, who understands land only as an entry on a balance sheet waiting to be improved. The Valley's older families have learned to recognize men like him quickly now, the practiced warmth in public settings, the impatience that surfaces the moment a negotiation does not move at the pace he expects. And before this day is finished, he will make the mistake of assuming that an old woman in a thin coat is the easiest person in the yard to humiliate. The auction yard smells like diesel and old hay, the 2 smells that have defined every gathering Geneva has ever attended in this valley, weddings included. Folding chairs have been arranged in uneven rows facing the platform, though most of the men standing near the front have no intention of sitting. They cluster instead, coffee cups steaming, boots too clean for real ranch work, trading numbers back and forth like men discussing a card game rather than the dismantling of a neighbor's life. Geneva moves through the edge of the crowd the way she has learned to move through most rooms since Thomas died, present but unclaimed, a shape that people's eyes slide past without registering. She finds Del near the fence line before she finds anyone else, his hat pulled low, his own hands jammed deep into his coat pockets against the cold. He does not say much when she reaches him. He never has. But he tilts his head toward the far stall, and Geneva follows the gesture, and there, standing half in shadow behind a gate too small for an animal his size, is Goliath. The horse is enormous still, even diminished. Even with ribs showing faintly beneath a coat that has not been brushed properly and longer than anyone would admit, even with one eye clouded milk white and unseeing, there is a frame to him that speaks of what he once was. Muscle built for pulling weight no ordinary horse could move. He stands with his head low, ears loose, the posture of an animal who has stopped expecting anything good to happen to him. When Geneva steps close enough that her shadow falls across the gate, something in him shifts. Not fear, recognition, maybe, or the ghost of it, a memory buried too deep in an animal's mind to have a name, but not too deep to matter. Del clears his throat, quiet, almost apologetic. He says the auctioneer is starting with equipment first, working toward livestock by mid-morning, and that most of the men here have their eyes on the grazing rights and the water access more than anything with a heartbeat. He says it like it should be a comfort. Geneva only nods, her eyes still on the horse, her hand resting on the top rail of the gate, though she has not touched the animal yet. Behind them, the platform stirs. Roy Petrie, the county's auctioneer for 30 years, climbs the 2 wooden steps with a clipboard under one arm and a voice already warming up in his throat. The practiced cadence of a man who has sold off other people's lives so many times it no longer registers to him as tragedy, only as work. He begins with the disc harrows and the fencing wire, his voice rising and falling in that strange musical patter, numbers climbing in small increments while the crowd murmurs and raises hands and cards without much drama. It is when the platform empties of machinery and fills instead with the county's veterinary inspector reading off livestock tags that the mood in the yard changes, subtly but unmistakably, the way weather changes before a storm a person cannot yet see. Harrison Voss steps down from wherever he has been standing and moves closer to the platform, and the crowd parts for him the way crowds part for money, without anyone deciding to do it. He is younger than Geneva expected, though she has heard the name Voss whispered around town enough times to have built some picture of him already, most of it wrong. He carries himself like a man who has never once been told no and believed it. When he speaks to the men near him, his voice does not rise, but it carries anyway, the particular volume of someone used to being heard whether or not he raises his voice. Someone in the crowd asks him, half joking, if he is here for the cattle. Harrison's answer is short, and he does not bother to disguise the amusement in it. He says he is not interested in cattle. He is interested in water, in access roads, in the kind of paperwork that will let his company build 40 vacation homes on land currently growing nothing but sagebrush and old grudges. The crowd laughs. It is an easy laugh, the kind that costs nothing and means everything. A signal passed between men who have already decided which side of the valley's future they intend to stand on. Geneva does not laugh. She turns back toward Goliath's stall, and it is in that moment, watching the horse's clouded eye drift toward the sound of the crowd, without any real comprehension of what is being decided about him, that something in her jaw sets, quiet and immovable, the way it used to set only when Thomas was alive to see it and know exactly what it meant. The bidding for livestock begins an hour later than scheduled, delayed by an argument over fencing rights that Roy Petrie settles with the practiced patience of a man who has heard every possible complaint a rural auction can produce. By the time the first animal is led up the ramp, a young quarter horse still bright-eyed and unbothered by the crowd. The morning sun has burned off enough of the valley fog to throw long shadows across the yard, and the temperature has crept up just enough for men to start shedding their heaviest coats. Geneva stays near the back, close enough to hear the numbers, far enough that she is not yet part of anyone's notice. She has learned, over 10 years of quiet survival, that visibility is a kind of currency best spent sparingly. But when Roy calls Goliath's name off the clipboard, and two ranch hands lead the old Clydesdale up the ramp with a rope looped loosely around his neck, Geneva feels her body move forward before her mind has finished deciding to let it. The horse walks slow, favoring one back leg, his clouded eye turned away from the crowd, as though some old instinct still tells him not to show his weakness to a room full of strangers. A few men near the front chuckle at the sight of him. Someone mutters something about glue factories, low enough to seem private, loud enough to be heard by everyone who wants to hear it. Roy, to his credit, does not join the joke. He reads the animal's age and condition off the clipboard in the same even tone he has used all morning, though something in his eyes flickers toward Geneva for half a second, the way a man's eyes flicker toward someone he suspects already knows more than he does. The bidding opens low, painfully low, a number that would insult a bag of feed, let alone a living creature. Geneva raises her hand at the second call, her voice steady even though her heart is not, and the sound of her own bid moving through the crowd feels, for a moment, like the only true thing said all morning. There is a pause, a ripple. A few heads turn to find the woman attached to the voice, and what they find is an aging widow in a coat gone thin at the elbows, standing alone near the back of a crowd dressed for money she clearly does not have. Someone near the platform laughs, not unkindly at first, more surprised than cruel. The laugh of men who have simply never considered that this particular horse might be worth fighting for. Then Harrison Voss raises 2 fingers, lazy, almost bored, and doubles the bid without so much as glancing at the animal he is bidding on. The crowd's attention shifts entirely. This is no longer a formality. This is entertainment, and Harrison, whether by instinct or design, understands exactly how to feed it. He raises the bid again before Geneva can even respond. Then again, his eyes finding hers across the yard for the first time, not with malice exactly, but with the particular curiosity of a man testing how far a thing will bend before it breaks. Dell leans close to Geneva's shoulder, his voice low and urgent. He tells her she does not have to do this. He tells her the horse is old, that there are other ways, that this feels like a fight she was never meant to win. Geneva does not look at him. Her eyes stay fixed on Goliath, standing exhausted and confused on the ramp, while men argue over what he is worth in dollars. And something in the set of her shoulders answers Dell's warning more clearly than any words could. Roy Petrie glances between the 2 bidders now, his clipboard forgotten in his hand, his auctioneer's rhythm faltering for the first time all morning as he seems to register, along with the rest of the crowd, that something has shifted in the temperature of the room. He has sold off enough neighbors' lives over the decades to recognize the particular quiet that falls over a crowd when a bidding war stops being about property and starts being about pride, and he hesitates half a beat longer than the moment requires before calling the next number, his eyes flicking once toward Geneva with something that might, in a kinder world, have been sympathy. Behind Geneva, 2 women in matching quilted vests murmur to each other without bothering to lower their voices completely, wondering aloud what kind of woman spends a fortune on an animal that will likely be dead within 2 winters regardless of who owns him. Their laughter carries easily across the cold air, thin and bright. The particular cruelty of people who have never once had to choose between sentiment and survival because they have never been poor enough for the difference to matter. She raises her hand again. The number climbs past what most working animals in this county have ever sold for. Somewhere behind her, a man mutters that the old woman has lost her mind. Somewhere else, another voice, quieter, almost admiring, wonders out loud what in the world that horse means to her. Neither comment reaches Geneva the way it might have 10 years ago, back when she still had a husband's arm to steady her against the noise of other people's opinions. Now there is only the horse and the countdown clock in her own chest, ticking toward a number she is not certain her savings can survive. Harrison raises the bid one more time, and this time he does not stop looking at her while he does it. There is something almost curious in his expression, the look of a man who has begun to wonder if the old woman across the yard understands something about this horse that he does not, and does not particularly care to ask, because caring would require treating her like she matters. Roy calls the new number into the cold morning air, and the crowd goes quiet enough that Geneva can hear the wind moving through the fence wire. And somewhere behind that wind, faint but unmistakable, the low tired sound of a horse exhaling through flared nostrils, as if he too is waiting to hear what happens next. The number hanging in the air belongs to Harrison now, and for 3 full seconds nobody moves, the whole yard suspended in the particular silence that settles over a crowd when they sense a decision is about to cost someone more than money. Geneva does the math in her head one last time. The number Harrison has set is not simply high. It is designed to be high, calculated by a man who has already noticed that the widow bidding against him will not simply walk away, and who has decided, perhaps without even admitting it to himself, that watching her walk away broke is more interesting than winning the horse cheaply. There is nothing in his expression that looks like cruelty exactly. It looks more like curiosity wearing cruelty's clothes, the particular blindness of men who have never once had to calculate whether an animal's life is worth their own comfort. She reaches into her coat and pulls out the folded bills she counted 3 times that morning, though she does not show them to anyone, only holds them the way a person holds proof of a decision already made. When she raises her hand this time, her voice carries the number that empties the account she has spent 10 years protecting, the number that means no cushion left for the well pump, no buffer against whatever the coming winter decides to break on her land. The yard makes a sound somewhere between a gasp and a laugh, the strange communal noise of people witnessing something they do not fully understand but recognize, on some animal level, as significant. A woman near the front mutters, just loud enough, that the old widow has finally lost whatever sense she had left. A man beside her adds that some folks would rather starve than admit a horse isn't worth saving. The laughter that follows is not cruel exactly, not all of it, but it does not need to be cruel to land the way it lands. Harrison studies her for a long moment. Something passes behind his eyes, not quite hesitation. More like the recalculation of a man who has just realized the game he is playing has stakes on the other side that he had not bothered to consider. He glances toward Roy, toward the crowd, toward the low, exhausted animal standing patient on the ramp, and then, with the particular grace of someone who has never lost anything that truly mattered to him, he lowers his hand and lets the bid stand. It is a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone not watching closely, but Dell notices it, and something in his posture eases slightly beside Geneva, the tension of a man who expected the worst finally allowing itself to loosen by half a degree. What none of them yet understand, not Dell, not Geneva, not even Harrison himself, is that the small mercy of letting the bid stand costs him nothing today and will cost him everything within 24 hours. The first quiet domino in a chain of consequences none of them can see coming from where they stand in the cold morning light. Roy's gavel comes down. The sound of it lands in Geneva's chest like a door closing on one kind of life and opening onto another she has not yet learned the shape of. The crowd's laughter shifts into something closer to applause, mocking in its rhythm, the kind of clapping people do when they have just watched someone lose spectacularly and want the loser to know they noticed. Geneva does not acknowledge any of it. She walks toward the ramp with the particular steadiness of a woman who has spent a lifetime learning not to let her face answer other people's noise. When she reaches Goliath, the horse turns his head, his one good eye finding her, and for a moment the entire yard seems to fall away. The laughter, the money, the young man in the charcoal coat still watching from the platform with an expression that has not quite decided what it feels. She lifts the rope from the hand of the ranch hand holding it and settles her palm against the horse's neck, and Goliath, slow and deliberate, leans his enormous head down until it rests against her chest, his breath warm and heavy against her collarbone, the closest thing to peace either of them has felt in longer than either can measure. For a moment neither of them moves, the crowd's noise reduced to something distant and unimportant, the way weather sounds from inside a house with the windows shut. Geneva's fingers find the coarse hair beneath the horse's jaw, tracing a line she has not touched in 15 years, since the last time she watched Thomas lead this same animal out of this same barn on the day money forced a decision neither of them wanted to make. Goliath's clouded eye drifts half shut. His enormous chest rises and falls in a rhythm that slows, gradually, to match something closer to calm than he has shown all morning. A ranch hand nearby mutters to another that he has never seen an animal take to a stranger that fast, and gets no answer, because there is no explanation either man could offer that would account for what is happening in front of them, only the plain fact of it. The moment does not last. It never does, in a place built for buying and selling. Somewhere behind Geneva, boots crunch against frozen gravel, unhurried, deliberate, the sound of a man who has decided the morning's entertainment is not yet finished. Somewhere behind her, Harrison steps down off the platform and crosses the yard with the unhurried confidence of a man who believes the day's real business has not yet begun. He does not offer congratulations. He does not offer an apology for the theater he orchestrated. Instead, he reaches into his coat and produces a folded document, crisp and official, and holds it out toward Geneva with the particular carelessness of someone accustomed to delivering bad news as though it were simply weather. He tells her, in a voice pitched for the benefit of anyone still listening, that her water rights expired the moment the county reassessed the watershed boundary, and that as of this morning, the creek feeding her property line falls inside a parcel his consortium acquired in the Pruitt liquidation. He tells her she has 30 days to vacate unless she can produce proof otherwise, though his tone makes clear he does not believe such proof exists. The crowd's laughter dies into something quieter, more uncertain, as though even they can sense that whatever line has just been crossed is different from the one crossed at the auction ramp. Geneva takes the paper without reading it, her hand steady around Goliath's rope, her eyes fixed on Harrison with an expression that gives him nothing to work with, no fear he can savor, no collapse he can add to his morning's accounting. She tells him, quiet enough that only he and Dell can hear it, that he ought to be more careful about what he thinks he owns. Harrison smiles, the smile of a man who has heard 1,000 empty threats and outlasted every one of them, and turns back toward his waiting truck, already speaking into his phone before he has crossed half the yard, already moving on to whatever the next acquisition on his list happens to be. The drive home takes longer than 11 minutes, with a Clydesdale walking behind the truck bed at the horse's own slow, uneven pace. Dell, following in his own vehicle with the trailer Geneva could not have afforded to rent on her own. Neither of them speaks much along the gravel road. The valley outside the windows looks different somehow, though nothing in it has physically changed since morning. Only the eyes looking at it, and what those eyes now understand about the men buying up its bones. By the time Goliath is settled into the old barn, the same barn where Thomas once trained him 15 years earlier, the afternoon light has gone thin and amber, stretching long shadows across a yard that suddenly feels smaller than Geneva remembers it. She stands at the stall door long after Dell has gone home, watching the horse eat from a feed bucket she filled with hands that will not entirely stop shaking, though whether from cold or something else, she does not examine too closely. The barn still holds the shape of Thomas in ways nothing else on the property does. His initials, carved into a support beam the winter they built the loft addition. A bridle hanging on a nail he hammered in crooked and never bothered to fix. The particular creak of the east door, swollen from 30 winters of frost, that Geneva has never once had repaired, though she could have afforded to a dozen times over. She runs her palm along the beam nearest the stall while Goliath eats, and for a moment the ache in her chest is not about the horse at all, or the eviction notice folded in her coat pocket, but about the plain, unbearable fact of a life continuing to happen in a place her husband is no longer present to witness. Goliath lifts his head from the bucket once, briefly, his good eye finding her in the dim light, and lowers it again, unbothered, the way an animal settles once it has decided a place is safe. Geneva watches him a while longer before she finally latches the stall door and crosses the darkening yard toward the house, the cold sharpening now that the sun has dropped fully behind the ridge, her breath visible ahead of her in short pale clouds. The document Harrison handed her sits unopened on the kitchen table when she finally returns to the house, the porch light buzzing faintly overhead, the same porch light Thomas replaced the year before he died and never got around to fixing properly. She sits across from it for a long while before she finally unfolds it, and what she reads inside confirms everything Harrison said in the yard, phrased in language dense enough to intimidate anyone without a lawyer of their own, threatening enough to make clear that 30 days is not a suggestion. She does not sleep well that night. The wind picks up sometime after midnight, rattling the loose shutter on the north side of the house that Thomas always meant to fix and never did. And somewhere in that restless dark, Geneva finds herself standing at the window that overlooks the barn, watching the shape of an old horse shift and settle in the dim glow of the yard light, an animal that cost her everything she had saved and asked for nothing in return except to be seen. Morning arrives gray and reluctant. Dell comes by before 8, his truck idling at the gate, his face carrying the particular tightness of a man who has heard more than Geneva has yet been told. He tells her that word is already moving through the valley, that Harrison's consortium filed papers the same afternoon as the auction, faster than anyone expected, and that at least 2 other families along the creek received similar notices before sundown. He tells her that some of the younger families are already talking about selling out rather than fighting a legal battle they cannot afford, that Harrison's company has offered buyout numbers dressed up to look generous, though everyone in the valley who has looked closely enough knows generous is not the word for it. Geneva listens without interrupting, her hands wrapped around a coffee she has not touched, and when Dell finishes, she asks him a single question, quiet and direct, about whether Thomas ever mentioned anything, in all his years running the ranch, about the water rights running deeper than the creek's surface. Dell shakes his head slowly. He tells her Thomas kept his business close, the way most men of his generation did, and that if there was ever a paper trail explaining anything unusual about the Callaway land, it would have gone to the family's lawyer, a man named Walter Hume, semi-retired now, living somewhere on the far side of the valley near the old mill. The name lands in Geneva's memory like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward toward a conversation she had almost entirely forgotten. A strange afternoon nearly 10 years ago when Thomas asked her to sign a stack of papers she never fully read, his voice unusually serious for a man who rarely allowed himself seriousness, telling her only that it was insurance, in case the Valle ever changed the way he feared it might. She had signed without asking many questions. She had trusted him the way a person trusts a spouse after 30 years of marriage, without needing every explanation spelled out. And in the 10 years since his death, she has never once thought to ask what those papers actually said, because there had been no reason to ask, no threat serious enough to make the question matter. Until now. Geneva stands from the table, the coffee finally forgotten entirely, and asks Dell if he can drive her to see Walter Hume before the day is finished. Dell studies her for a long moment, something shifting behind his own tired eyes, the recognition of a woman about to walk into a fight far larger than a horse auction. And then he nods and reaches for his keys, and neither of them says another word until the truck is already moving down the gravel road toward whatever answer is waiting on the far side of the valley. Walter Hume's office occupies the front room of a house, so old it seems to lean slightly into the wind. Ledgers and land deeds stacked along every wall in the particular disorder of a man who has never once needed to explain his filing system to anyone but himself. He is older than Geneva by nearly a decade, his hands trembling faintly with the same tremor she has noticed in men his age all over the valley, though his eyes, when they meet hers across the doorway, sharpen instantly with a recognition that suggests he has been expecting this visit for longer than she realizes. He does not ask why she has come. He simply rises, slower than he once would have, and moves toward a locked cabinet in the corner of the room, retrieving a small brass key from a chain around his neck that Geneva suspects has not left his skin in years. From the cabinet he lifts a dark steel case, heavier than its size suggests, and sets it on the desk between them with a care that borders on reverence. He tells her, before he opens it, that Thomas came to him 11 years ago with an instruction so specific it left no room for interpretation. The case was to remain sealed unless Geneva ever faced an attempt to remove her from the land, whether through debt, through legal maneuvering, or through anything resembling what Harrison Voss delivered in that auction yard less than 24 hours ago. Walter says he received a phone call from another rancher along the creek that very morning, describing the eviction notices spreading through the valley like brushfire, and that the moment he heard Harrison's name attached to those notices, he knew the seal on this case had finally reached its purpose. Geneva's hands do not shake when he opens the case, though something in her chest tightens with the particular vertigo of standing at the edge of a decision she did not know she had already made 10 years earlier without fully understanding it. Inside, beneath a layer of aged manila folders, lies a set of documents bound in leather gone soft with age, the seal of a land trust foundation pressed into the cover, dated to the turn of the previous century, decades before either Geneva or Thomas were born. Walter explains, his voice steady despite its tremor, that Thomas discovered the trust's existence during a title search nearly 11 years ago, an obscure conservation easement written into the valley's earliest water rights charter, one designed originally to prevent large-scale industrial mining from poisoning the watershed. The mechanism had lain dormant for generations, forgotten by everyone except the handful of families whose land it once protected, its language so antiquated that most modern lawyers, Harrison's included, would never think to search for it at all. Thomas, Walter explains, spent the better part of 2 years quietly acquiring the trust's dormant rights through an anonymous foundation, using every dollar the ranch could spare and several loans Geneva never knew existed, securing not the surface land itself, but the subsurface mineral and water rights beneath the entire watershed feeding the valley floor. Every well, every creek, every foundation poured for a house, a resort, a road. All of it requires access to water that flows through rights Thomas purchased and placed, upon his death, into a trust with a single named executor. Walter turns the final page toward her, and there, in ink faded but legible, Geneva finds her own name, written in her husband's hand, naming her sole executor of the Bitterroot Watershed Conservation Trust, with full and irrevocable authority over every permit, easement, and access agreement required to develop a single acre within its boundary. The silence in the room stretches long enough that the old clock on Walter's wall becomes audible, ticking through seconds that feel, to Geneva, like the exact shape of 10 years finally arriving somewhere they were always headed. Walter tells her, gently, that Thomas never explained his full reasoning, only that he wanted her protected in a way that could not be argued away by lawyers or bought off by developers. A legacy built not from ambition, but from a quiet, stubborn love for land he suspected the world would eventually try to take from her. Walter turns to a second folder within the case, one containing correspondence Thomas exchanged with a historical land trust society 2 states away. Men who had spent their careers tracking the fate of century-old conservation easements most modern courts had never been asked to interpret. The letters describe a provision, buried in language written before automobiles were common on Montana roads, granting the trust's executor authority not only over new construction, but over any modification to existing water infrastructure across the watershed, a scope far broader than either Thomas or Walter fully appreciated when the papers were first filed. It means, Walter explains, that Geneva's authority extends not just to blocking Harrison's resorts, but to every rancher along the creek who might one day need her signature simply to repair an aging well or reroute an irrigation line. An obligation as much as it is a power, one Thomas seemed to have understood clearly even if he never lived to explain it to her himself. Geneva asks, quietly, why he never told her while he was alive, why a decision this large was made and sealed away rather than shared between them the way every other decision in their marriage had been. Walter has no answer that satisfies either of them completely, only a guess, offered carefully, that Thomas perhaps feared the knowledge itself might change how she carried herself through the valley, might invite exactly the kind of scrutiny and resentment that a document like this, revealed too early, could bring down on a woman already grieving. It is not an answer that erases the ache of 10 years spent not knowing. But it is, Walter suggests, the only kind of answer a man like Thomas would have thought to give. Walter explains further, his voice softer now, that Thomas had come to him not once, but 3 separate times over those 2 years, each visit more urgent than the last, as though he had been racing something only he could see coming over the horizon. The final visit, weeks before the diagnosis that would take him within the year, Thomas had sat in this very chair and made Walter swear, on nothing less than his own standing as a licensed attorney of 30 years, that the seal would never be broken for convenience, for a good market, for anything less than the exact circumstance now sitting across the desk from him. Walter admits, quietly, that there were nights over the past decade he wondered if he would carry that secret to his own grave without ever having cause to open it, and that some part of him, watching the valley change these past 2 years, had begun to fear the trust might already be too late to matter. Geneva sits with the trust documents in her lap for a long while, her eyes moving across her husband's handwriting, and something in her face shifts, not triumph exactly, closer to grief reopened and answered in the same breath, the particular ache of understanding, 10 years too late, exactly how carefully she had been loved. Outside Walter's window, the light has gone the color of late afternoon, long and gold across the fields, and somewhere in the distance a dog barks twice and falls silent. Geneva closes the leather cover over the trust documents with the same careful hand she used to sign papers she never fully read a decade earlier, understanding now that the trust was never about money or spite, or even the valley itself, but about a husband's last quiet act of protection, delivered 10 years late and exactly on time. The following morning, Harrison Voss arrives at Geneva's gate expecting to deliver the second half of an eviction he assumes has already broken her spirit. He steps out of his truck with the same unhurried confidence that carried him through the auction yard, a folder of paperwork under one arm, his phone already half raised to document whatever capitulation he expects to find waiting. What he finds instead is Walter Hume standing beside Geneva at the porch steps, the steel case resting open on the railing between them, and Dell a few paces back, arms crossed, watching Harrison's approach with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has waited a long time to see someone like him meet a wall he cannot buy his way through. Walter does the talking. He explains, in the same even tone he has used to settle land disputes for 40 years, exactly what the trust documents mean, exactly whose signature now governs every water access permit in the valley, and exactly how much money Harrison's consortium has already spent acquiring land that cannot legally support a single foundation without Geneva's consent. Harrison's expression moves through several stages before settling into something Geneva has not yet seen from him, a kind of stunned recalculation, the look of a man discovering that the ground beneath his ambitions was never as solid as his bank account assured him it was. He argues, briefly, that the trust must be outdated, unenforceable, a technicality any competent legal team could dissolve within months. Walter answers this by producing a second document, a state Supreme Court ruling from decades earlier upholding an identical trust structure in a neighboring county, precedent enough to guarantee any challenge would cost Harrison's investors years and millions before resolving anything in his favor. Harrison looks toward Geneva then, searching her face for something to negotiate with, some flicker of fear or desperation he can exploit the way he exploited the auction floor. He finds instead a woman standing exactly as still as she stood the day before, her hand resting lightly on the porch railing beside the case that now holds more power over this valley than his entire consortium combined. She tells him, without raising her voice, that he is welcome to build his resorts wherever water is not required, and that the valley will remain exactly as it has always been, in the hands of the families who have tended it, for as long as she draws breath to protect it. Harrison does not respond to that. He simply folds his paperwork closed, some private calculation already running behind his eyes, the arithmetic of a man realizing that this particular loss cannot be undone by outspending it, and turns back toward his truck without another word, his usual confidence replaced by something quieter, chastened in a way that will likely never fully surface as an apology, but has clearly registered nonetheless. Before he reaches the truck, Harrison stops, one hand on the door, and turns back toward the porch for a moment longer than the conversation requires. Something crosses his face that Geneva has not seen from him before, not quite regret, closer to the specific discomfort of a man realizing, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, that he has spent his morning mocking someone who was never beneath him to begin with. He does not apologize. Men like Harrison rarely learn to say the word out loud, not this early in their lives, not while there is still money left on the table to distract them from the lesson. But he holds Geneva's gaze a beat longer than necessary before he climbs into the truck, and whatever passes between them in that silence is its own kind of acknowledgement, quieter than an apology, and perhaps, for now, enough. The truck pulls away down the gravel road, dust rising behind it in the cold morning light, and Geneva watches it go with an expression that carries no triumph, only the tired, complicated relief of a woman who has spent 30 days believing she might lose everything, only to discover the ground was never truly in danger, only her understanding of how deep her husband's love had reached to protect it. Dell exhales beside her, a long breath he seems to have been holding since the truck first appeared at the gate, and says only that he never doubted her, though the look on his face when Harrison's paperwork first arrived told a different story entirely. Geneva does not correct him. She only closes her hand once more around the steel case resting on the railing, feeling its weight settle into her palm the way responsibility settles into a person who has just learned she is carrying more than she ever asked to carry, and turns back toward the house, toward the barn, toward the long quiet work of a life that is, against every expectation the valley held for her that morning at the auction, still entirely her own. Winter arrives late that year, though it arrives eventually, the way it always does. Snow settles over the valley in a hush that makes the fence lines look, for a few weeks each year, like something out of an old photograph. Geneva spends the season the way she has spent every season since Thomas died, tending what needs tending, though this year the chores carry a different weight, lighter somehow, less like survival and more like stewardship. Goliath recovers slowly, the way old animals do, weight returning to his frame in patient increments, his blind eye still clouded, but his stance steadier each week, his presence in the barn a quiet daily reminder of the choice Geneva made in an auction yard full of people who believed she had nothing left to lose. He follows her now, when she crosses the yard, his enormous head bowing occasionally to rest against her shoulder in the particular gesture he seems to have decided belongs only to her. Harrison's consortium quietly withdraws its remaining offers along the creek by early spring, the buyout numbers disappearing from mailboxes as suddenly as they arrived. The construction trailer at the old Pruitt place hauled away on a flatbed one gray morning, while most of the valley is still asleep. Some of the younger families who had already signed away their land find themselves in a strange legal limbo for a season, though Walter Hume, Working alongside Geneva as the trust's newly acknowledged executor, spends the following months quietly untangling what agreements he can, restoring access where restoration is possible, offering what protection the old conservation trust allows to neighbors who never knew, until now, that anyone still had the power to offer it. Geneva does not become wealthy in any way the Valley's new arrivals would recognize as wealth. She does not build a gate at the end of her driveway, or hire staff, or replace the old pickup that still coughs twice before the engine catches. She simply continues, as she always has, tending land that Thomas loved enough to protect from beyond his own death, carrying a grief that has not disappeared so much as found new company, folded now alongside a strange, complicated gratitude she did not expect to feel this late in her life. Dell begins coming by more often that spring, not out of obligation, but out of the particular gravity two lonely households sometimes settle into without ever naming it, sharing coffee some mornings, splitting the cost of a new water pump another, the beginnings of a friendship neither of them rushes to define. Walter Hume, for his part, retires fully from his practice that same year, though he continues advising Geneva on trust matters from his porch most Sunday afternoons, a role he seems to find more satisfying than any billable hour he logged in the 4 decades before it. The valley itself heals slowly, the way land always does. The surveyor stakes pulled up one by one over the following seasons, the Grange Hall eventually reclaimed by a group of ranching families who convert it back into what it always was, a place for the valley to gather without money changing hands. Not every family recovers what they lost. 2 of the younger households that sold out before the trust came to light never return, their parcels sitting fallow for a time before smaller, more modest buyers take them on, families drawn by the same quiet the valley has always offered rather than the luxury it briefly promised outsiders. Geneva carries the weight of that loss too, aware that her victory arrived a season too late for everyone, a fact she does not allow herself to forget even in the valley's better moments. On the anniversary of Thomas's death that year, she walks out to the barn before sunrise, the way she has every year for a decade, and finds Goliath already awake, his head turned toward the door as if he had been waiting for her. She stands with him a long while in the cold, her hand resting against his neck, the valley outside still and silent, and, for the first time and longer than she can remember, entirely her own to protect. The Bitterroot Valley does not remember auctions the way it remembers winters, but the people who stood in that yard the day an old widow spent her last dollar on a horse nobody wanted have not forgotten what happened next. They tell it now the way stories get told in small places, softened at the edges, sharpened where it matters, a reminder passed quietly between neighbors that the people who look like they have nothing left to lose are sometimes the only ones still holding everything that counts. Geneva never asked to be remembered that way. She only ever wanted the horse to live out his years somewhere he was wanted. Everything the valley kept because of it was simply the quiet math of a marriage that outlasted its own ending, one signature at a time.